I hope everyone is having a wonderful afternoon or morning. I know I'm the last presentation, so I will try not to put you all to sleep. My name is Mackenzie Jerrold. I am presenting today on why we need a shift in our approach to autism. So, as I said, I am Mackenzie. I am a senior at Capstone Academy in Atlanta, Georgia. And Ariana was my wonderful mentor from Polygence who helped work with me on my research paper. My neuroscience interest stems from experiences with family members and friends who are part of the neurodivergent community. So, first, I'd like to provide some background information and general statistics about autism. Autism is experienced by about 75 million people around the world. This equates to approximately 1% of the world's population. Additionally, 1 in 36 children are diagnosed with autism every year in the United States. Autism is also known as autism spectrum disorder, as people who are autistic range from low to high support needs. The description of autism from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual is that it is a developmental disorder with social communication deficits and a tendency to participate in ritualistic behaviors. Some common traits include difficulty with eye contact, obsessive interests, and also a need for sameness. One quote that I find important to share when discussing autism is this quote by autistic autism researcher Dr. Stephen Shore. If you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. This demonstrates really how broad the spectrum is and that everybody on the spectrum is just as unique as any other human being. So now I'd like to cover the current science. The diagnostic process consists of two components, the social and behavioral component, and any traits falling under these categories must be present during the early developmental period. Because this is a behavior-only based assessment, it does cause some difficulties when it comes to diagnosing autism. The first is that autism presents differently in different genders. Girls are typically known to mask better, which means hiding aspects of your true self or hiding your characteristics to better fit into a neurotypical society. Additionally, autism presents differently at different ages, which means that it would be nice to have a criteria which could maybe account for that because currently we only have one criteria and different age groups are not listed. Additionally, we do not have a biomarker, which means no genetic tests or blood tests or brain scans can be conducted to diagnose someone with autism. Some common treatments for autism include applied behavioral analysis. This is the most common treatment and is done in an intensive clinical individual setting. Some developmental treatments can also address some comorbidities of autism, such as speech delays or coordination challenges, in which an occupational therapist or speech therapist could be very helpful, and alternative treatments exist as well. There is, however, also some controversy when it comes to treatment, and ABA in particular has some controversy surrounding it. So, a lot of critics point to its roots as discrete trial training in the 1960s as a reason why it should no longer be used today. Back in the 1960s, they used electric shocks and other punishments to incentivize positive behaviors. While this is no longer the case, a lot of critics still point to its use as simply making autistic people more neurotypical as opposed to accepting them for who they are. So now I'd like to propose a change in our approach. How can we shift our perspective to better include those of the autistic community and make sure that they feel safe in their environment? So when talking about applied behavioral analysis, I think it is important to talk about four aspects. The first is the idea of fixing. Applied behavioral analysis typically addresses things like eye contact, reading body language, or stimming behaviors. But in reality, these behaviors that the autistic person is engaging in is not causing any challenges or direct harm to the autistic individual. The only reason they are being addressed is because they're not acceptable to the neurotypical population. For that reason, I think it is more important that we focus on accepting autistic individuals the way they are so that we can avoid actual problems associated with autism, such as negative mental health. Communication is another aspect that ABA focuses on heavily, and communicating is vital to the self-advocacy capabilities of the autistic population. However, communication can only be developed at a certain period of time when the brain is most plastic, And a lot of autistic children may miss that window because they are not motivated by social factors in the same way that neurotypical children may be. For that reason, I find it very important that we start introducing multimodal communication much earlier. This could include picture communication, and perhaps this would make more sense to a young autistic child who is interested in communicating but cannot express themselves verbally. The idea that ABA is making people more neurotypical is another thing often criticized by many autism advocates. And there are these behaviors that I mentioned earlier that may not actually be causing harm to the autistic individual. However, there are some behaviors, such as self harm behaviors, that are very problematic. Therefore, it is vital that we address these behaviors in ABA. If an activity like wearing a jacket is causing an autistic child or person a significant amount of sensory overstimulation to the point that they need to bang their head against a wall or participate in some other self harm activity, it is important that this self harm behavior doesn't simply get removed because that behavior is serving an emotional purpose to the autistic person. For that reason, we must slowly desensitize wearing a jacket or whatever the activity is by practicing aspects of it until it becomes less overstimulating. Finally, self advocacy is the best way for an autistic person to have input into their treatment. I think that we should not be changing autistic people without their consent, especially when it comes to having them fit into a more neurotypical environment. While communication and self harm behaviors do need to be addressed early on, everything else should be up to the autistic individual. Because when we force societal norms on the autistic population, masking can innately occur. And this is actually very dangerous because it can cause an autistic person to feel that they are never truly accepted by their peers because their peers don't actually know who they are behind the mask. Now I'd like to discuss some of the verbiage used in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. So the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual is a very important manual to the autistic population because it outlines exactly how they can get diagnosed. And these words, deficit, abnormal, and failure, appear more than once on this Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. I find that these words are extremely harmful to the self-image of the autistic community. For example, deficit could imply that an autistic person is not enough, or maybe they're lacking in some areas. Abnormal is comparing them against a very subjective standard of normal that really no human being can possibly adhere to. And the word failure is placing blame on the autistic person for their autistic traits or characteristics. All of this leads to society viewing them as less than the neurotypical population, and it can lead to their exclusion in society and feelings of anxiety, depression, and loneliness. Finally, I'd like to introduce the double empathy problem. The double empathy problem was a term coined by autism researcher Damian Milton in 2012 and essentially states that autistic people are not the ones responsible for difficulties in communicating among neurotypes. It is actually the mismatch of neurotypes, communication between autistic and non-autistic people, that accounts for the challenges experienced in communication. To test his hypothesis, some researchers did a diffusion chain experiment in which there were 3 groups of just autistic people, 3 groups of just non-autistic people, and 3 groups of mixed neurotypes. In each group, they played a game of telephone in which they shared a story, and at the end, it was seen how well the story was communicated. It was found that both the non-autistic and the just autistic groups communicated this story equally as well. However, the group with mixed neurotypes had significantly more challenges when it came to sharing the story. This experiment and the results of the experiment would support the idea of the double empathy problem and suggest that we as a society need to remember that it is not autistic people necessarily or the neurodivergent community who have challenges. It is actually everyone who needs to participate in including them into society. So, how can you help? First, educate yourself. What does it mean to be autistic? Surround yourself with autistic people or people who know what an autistic experience feels like, and that's the best way that you can really understand the autistic population. Next, accept. Accept and love autistic people exactly the way they are because they have benefits to society just like any other human being. Ask. Don't impose stereotypes because every autistic person is different and has different support needs. That's why we must ask how we can best support each individual as opposed to assuming that the autistic population as a whole has one way that they need supported. And finally, we must redefine autism, not as something negative, but as something positive and necessary for the diversity of our planet. We have to surround it with positive language and remove the underlying subjective concept of normal. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to email me or ask them now, and you can read my published paper on CurU Academic Journal.
Thank you so much, Mackenzie. Very provocative discussion and presentation. I'm curious to know, how did your research change your perspective on how to approach autism from when you started to when you finished?
That's actually a very good question. I started out this research paper kind of from a more neuroscience perspective, focusing on the science of autism and what it looks like in the brain and how that correlates with specific behaviors. But I actually watched a TED talk by an autistic researcher. They have a PhD. Their name is Jack Den Houting. And if you're interested in learning more, I highly recommend it. But that TED Talk actually immediately made me think about the way that autism is perceived in society and the way that autistic people actually feel about their diagnosis. So, during that early stage of my research is when I really started shifting towards this new perspective and advocating for the autistic population in a way that they can become better accepted in society. So my point of view actually changed significantly throughout my research, and I'm very grateful to have seen that TED Talk so early on in this process.
Thank you so much for sharing.